the grand theater of marriage, the most convincing actors are often the ones who have forgotten they are wearing a mask. But when the curtains of crisis fall, the true face is always revealed, often in the harshest of spotlights. For Eleanor Vance, the stage was a sprawling colonial home in the heart of Connecticut, a place of manicured lawns and sun-drenched kitchens, where the performance of the perfect life had been running for 15 years. Her husband, Richard, a charismatic financial consultant, was a masterful leading man, and their two children, Lily and Leo, were the beautiful, innocent co-stars in their idyllic family production. Eleanor, a talented interior architect, had designed their world with love and precision, believing every line, every scene, every promise whispered when the lights were low. The first act began to unravel on a cold November afternoon. For weeks, a persistent fatigue had clung to her. A subtle tremor in her hands had made her design sketches difficult. A fog had settled in her mind. She had dismissed it as stress, the cost of a busy life. But the diagnosis, delivered in the sterile quiet of a neurologist's office, was a brutal tearing of the script. It was a rare, progressive neurological disorder. The words hung in the air, clinical and cold. The disease was not a death sentence, the doctor explained, but a life sentence, a slow, creeping thief that would steal her mobility and demand a fortune in long-term care. In that moment of pure, crystalline fear, Eleanor looked at her husband, searching for the comfort of her leading man, her partner. But the man sitting beside her was a stranger. There was no grief in his eyes, no shared terror. Instead, she saw a flicker of something else, something cold and appallingly clear: calculation. The mask of the devoted husband did not fall off, it simply became transparent. She could see the gears turning behind his perfectly feigned expression of concern, the silent tabulation of costs, of burdens, of inconveniences. The terror inside her shifted, morphing into a new and more profound horror. The greatest threat to her life was not the insidious disease attacking her nerves, but the man whose hand she was holding, a man who was already rewriting the end of their story, with her character written out of the final act. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you must first understand the beauty of the cage. It was a magnificent cage, gilded and spacious, a place other people peered into with envy. The Vance residence in Greenwich, Connecticut, was more than a house. It was Eleanor's masterpiece, a living testament to her talent. She had designed every room to catch the morning light, curated every piece of furniture to balance comfort with elegance. It was a home built for laughter, for family dinners, for the quiet hum of a life well lived. Eleanor had poured her soul into its walls, believing she was building a fortress for her family's happiness. She was a woman of substance, a graduate of RISD, whose name had once been whispered as the next rising star in architecture. But she had met Richard, and his ambition was a fire so bright it had seemed romantic to warm her hands by it. She chose a different path, scaling back her own career to freelance from a home studio. It was a choice, she told herself, a loving compromise to raise Lily and Leo, to host the flawless dinner parties that greased the wheels of Richard's career, to be the ever-present, supportive wife. She did not see it as a sacrifice, but as an investment in their shared future. Richard Vance was the kind of man who seemed sculpted from ambition itself. Handsome, articulate, with a smile that could disarm the most cynical investor, he was the engine of their glamorous life. He handled the finances, the investments, the grand strategy of their existence. "You make the world beautiful, Elle," he would often say, kissing her forehead, "and I'll make sure we can afford it." It was a division of labor that felt natural, romantic even. She was the artist, he was the benefactor. She trusted him implicitly, with her heart, her career, and her future. She saw his long hours and frequent business trips not as absences, but as proof of his devotion to their family. She defended his occasional emotional distance as the byproduct of a brilliant mind burdened by immense pressure. She was the caretaker of his home, his children, and his public image. And she played her part to perfection, unaware that she was the only one in the marriage who didn't know it was a role. The primary antagonist of her domestic bliss, however, was not Richard's ambition, but its source, his mother, Beatrice Vance. Beatrice was a woman carved from ice who viewed her son's marriage as a corporate merger in which he had acquired a beautiful but ultimately depreciating asset. She would visit their home, her eyes scanning every detail with an appraiser's coldness. "Another new painting, Eleanor?" she might remark, running a gloved finger over a gilded frame. "Richard must be doing exceptionally well to support your hobbies." Every compliment was a veiled accusation, every gift a reminder of who held the purse strings. She spoke of Richard's hard-earned money as if Eleanor were a decorative leech upon it, rather than the woman who had given up her own earning potential to create the very platform from which he launched his success. Eleanor absorbed these barbs with a quiet grace, dismissing them as the anxieties of an overbearing mother. She couldn't see that Beatrice was not just commenting on the family finances. She was actively reinforcing Richard's own secret resentments. Looking back from the cold, harsh reality of her diagnosis, Eleanor could now see the cracks that had been spreading through the foundation of their lives for years. They were not the sudden fractures of an earthquake, but the slow, insidious fissures caused by a steady, hidden pressure. The business trips, once a source of pride, now seemed different in her memory. She recalled the vague itineraries, the hushed phone calls he would take in his study with the door closed. She remembered the time she had playfully picked up his ringing phone to pass it to him, and the flash of pure fury in his eyes before he masked it with a tight smile. At the time, she had felt a chill of confusion, but had quickly chastised herself for being suspicious. Now, she saw it for what it was, the guarding of a secret life. The conversations about money, or the lack thereof, became a recurring scene in her memory's bleak theater. She'd approach him with a school tuition bill or a quote for landscaping, and he would sigh, a performance of profound weariness. "I'll handle it, Elle. Just let me worry about the numbers." It was a masterful act of control disguised as protection. He positioned himself as the sole guardian of their prosperity, making her feel like a kept woman, a beautiful, naive child who couldn't possibly comprehend the complexities of their wealth. In doing so, he isolated her from her own financial security, severing her connection to the resources she had helped to create. She had willingly handed him the keys to their kingdom, never realizing he was systematically changing all the locks. The gilded cage was not only beautiful, it was secure. But its security was never designed to protect her. It was designed to keep her in, unaware and powerless, until the day her keeper decided he no longer had any use for what was inside. In the days that followed, Richard played the part of the devoted husband with chilling precision. It was a performance, a meticulously rehearsed role, and Eleanor was his captive audience. He drove her to her appointments, his hand resting on her knee in a gesture that looked like comfort but felt like possession. He would sit in waiting rooms, his brow furrowed with what appeared to be deep concern, but his eyes were always on his phone, scrolling through stock market updates. He spoke to her in a new tone, a soft, patronizing cadence one might use for a child or a pet. He brought her blankets she didn't ask for and glasses of water she didn't need, small acts of care that felt more like the management of an inconvenient object than the loving support of a partner. His compassion was a hollow echo in their magnificent house, a ghost of a feeling that had long since departed. The true narrative of his concern revealed itself not in whispers of love, but in spreadsheets and bottom lines. The theme of their marriage shifted from shared dreams to a looming financial crisis, a crisis for which her body was solely responsible. One evening, he sat her down at the grand mahogany dining table, not for a meal, but for a presentation. His laptop glowed between them, casting a cold blue light on his face. "I've been running the numbers, Elle," he began, his voice laced with a somber gravity. He showed her columns of figures, projections of medical costs that stretched out for years, a mountain of debt that seemed insurmountable. He wasn't sharing a burden, he was assigning blame. "The insurance will only cover so much," he said, shaking his head. "The experimental treatments, the home care you'll eventually need. We may have to liquidate some assets. We have to think about Lily and Leo's future." Her illness was no longer a personal tragedy. It was a threat to the Vance legacy, a liability on a balance sheet, and he was the stoic manager tasked with damage control. His mother, Beatrice soon joined the campaign, becoming the chief architect of Eleanor's psychological isolation. She would arrive unannounced, her presence sucking the warmth from the room. She would bypass Eleanor, who might be resting on the sofa, and go straight to the kitchen to criticize the housekeeper or inspect the contents of the refrigerator. To Eleanor, she would offer backhanded condolences that were steeped in accusation. "You were always so high-strung, dear," she'd say, patting Eleanor's hand with cold, dry fingers. "All that ambition with your little design business. Stress is a terrible thing for the body." The implication was clear. You did this to yourself. But her true poison was reserved for the children. Eleanor would watch from her window as Beatrice intercepted Lily and Leo coming home from school, wrapping them in her arms on the front lawn. She'd hear snippets of their conversations later, the children growing quiet and hesitant around her. "Grandma says we have to be very careful not to tire you out, Mommy," 10-year-old Leo said one afternoon, stopping at her bedroom door as if it were the entrance to a sick room he was forbidden to enter. Beatrice was teaching them to see their mother not as a source of comfort, but as a fragile, breakable thing, a problem to be managed from a safe distance. The final thread in this carefully woven net of manipulation was presented as an act of love. After weeks of financial dread and creeping isolation, Richard came to her as she rested in bed. The afternoon light was fading, and her body ached with a profound weariness that was as much from the soul as it was from her nerves. He sat on the edge of the bed, taking her hand. His touch was soft, his expression a mask of tender sorrow. "I've been thinking about your company," he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur. "Vance Interiors. It was your baby, your passion. You built it from nothing." Eleanor felt a small, weak flutter of pride. It was the one part of her identity that was still truly hers. "You're not well enough to run it now, my love," he continued, stroking her hair. "And I saw the latest valuation. It's worth quite a bit." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "I know how much it means to you, but the money from the sale would solve everything. The medical bills, the kids' college funds, all of it. It would take all this terrible pressure off of us." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Think of it, Eleanor. What a beautiful, selfless thing to do. A sacrifice for your family." It was a masterstroke of cruelty, dressing up the destruction of her last vestige of independence as a noble act. He wasn't asking for her business, he was asking for her surrender, and in the exhausted, terrified depths of her soul, she no longer had the strength to refuse. The sale of Vance Interiors was completed on a Tuesday. Eleanor signed the final papers from her bed, her hand guided by Richard's, her signature a weak, spidery version of its former self. A wire transfer notification pinged on Richard's phone, and he smiled, a tight, satisfied expression that didn't reach his eyes. He called it their safety net. For Eleanor, it felt like the cutting of her last anchor to the woman she used to be. She was adrift now, completely dependent on his mercy, and it was precisely then, when she was at her most helpless, that he withdrew it. It happened 3 months to the day after her diagnosis. She was in the kitchen, leaning heavily against the counter, watching the rain lash against the windows. He walked in, dressed not in his weekend clothes, but in a tailored suit, looking as though he were heading to a board meeting. He didn't touch her. He stood by the island, placing his car keys deliberately on the cold granite surface. "It's done," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of all the feigned sympathy of the past weeks. It was the voice he used on conference calls when a deal was closing. Eleanor looked at him, confused. "The sale?" she asked weakly. "No," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with a cold finality. "Us. I'm leaving, Eleanor." The words didn't register at first. They seemed to belong to a different language, a different reality. But then he spoke again, and the meaning sliced through the fog of her illness like a shard of glass. "I've thought about this from every angle," he continued, his tone brutally reasonable. "This isn't a life, it's a slow decline, and I will not be the audience for it. I didn't sign up to be a caretaker, Eleanor. I need a partner, not a patient." There was no anger, no sadness, just the chilling logic of a man cutting his losses. It was a business decision. She was a bad investment, and he was liquidating the asset. She stared at him, speechless, her world collapsing into a silent, screaming vortex. He simply picked up his keys and walked out, the sound of the front door closing behind him, as final as a gavel strike. The efficiency of his departure was breathtaking. It was the work of a man who had planned for months, waiting for the perfect moment to execute. The next morning, the notifications began. An email from the bank, alerting her to a zero balance in their joint savings account, the very account where the money from her business sale had been deposited just days before. Her credit card was declined when she tried to order groceries online. A quick, panicked call to the bank confirmed her worst fears. Richard had systematically emptied their shared financial life, transferring the funds to a private account she had no access to. He had left her with the shell of their marriage, the mortgage, the car payments, and a mountain of her own medical bills, which now seemed to fall like acid rain from the sky. He hadn't just left her, he had financially gutted her, leaving her to bleed out alone. 2 days later, the ultimate blow arrived via a cold, indifferent courier. It was a thick, legal envelope. Inside were the divorce papers, but nestled within them was a document that was far more vicious. It was a motion for emergency sole custody of Lily and Leo. Her hands trembled as she read the sworn affidavit, Richard's words twisted into cruel legal prose by an expensive lawyer. Her symptoms were meticulously listed, not as the effects of a tragic illness, but as proof of her incompetence. Her fatigue was labeled as an inability to provide basic supervision. Her memory fog was described as a state of mental confusion that endangers the children. The emotional distress she had suffered, the tears she had shed in the face of his coldness, were reframed as severe emotional instability. He was using the very illness he had claimed to want to help her fight as a weapon to take her children, painting her as an unfit, hysterical invalid. The social assassination was just as swift and merciless. When she finally gathered the strength to call her closest friend, Sarah, the wife of Richard's business partner, the line was cold. "Eleanor, Sarah stammered, her voice thick with discomfort. Richard explained everything. "We're so sorry you're going through this, that you're not yourself." The narrative was set. He was the long-suffering husband, forced to make an impossible choice for the sake of his children. She was the unstable, hysterical woman who had let herself go, a burden he could no longer carry. She could almost hear Beatrice's voice in the background of every stilted conversation, a venomous whisper campaign painting her as the villain of her own tragedy. Within a week, her world had been razed to the ground. She was alone in the cavernous, empty house, surrounded by final demand notices and legal documents that stripped her of her identity, first as a wife, then as a mother. The gilded cage had been a prison of lies, but this was the abyss. He hadn't just closed the door on their marriage. He had locked it, set the house on fire, and left her to burn. The gilded cage was dismantled piece by piece. First went the art from the walls, then the designer furniture, sold for pennies on the dollar to cover the initial onslaught of legal fees. Finally, the house itself, her beautiful, light-filled masterpiece, was surrendered to the bank. The day she left, the silence of the empty rooms echoed with the ghosts of laughter, of family meals, of a life that now felt like a fiction she had read about long ago. Her new reality was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building, with cracking linoleum floors and a view of a soot-stained brick wall. The air smelled of stale cooking and disinfectant. Every sound, the neighbor's television, the traffic outside, the mournful groan of the ancient refrigerator, was a constant, grating reminder of how far she had fallen. Here, in this cramped and dreary box, the abyss truly opened up. The stress of her situation acted as a fertilizer for her illness. The tremors in her hands became so pronounced she could barely hold a pen. The fatigue was a physical weight, pinning her to the thin mattress for hours, sometimes days, at a time. But the physical decay was nothing compared to the erosion of her spirit. She was haunted by the legal documents that called her an unfit mother, by the pitying glances of the court-appointed supervisor who monitored her weekly visits with her own children. The visits were a special kind of hell. Lily and Leo were quiet and watchful, their childhood innocence fractured by a confusion they couldn't comprehend. They were afraid to touch her too much, as if her sadness were contagious. She would watch them leave, their hands held by a stranger who would deliver them back to their father's new life. And the loneliness that followed was a physical presence, a cold, heavy thing that sat on her chest and made it hard to breathe. Just when Eleanor thought she had reached the absolute floor of her despair, Beatrice arrived to prove she could still fall further. She appeared at the apartment door one afternoon, unannounced, carrying a single cardboard box. "Richard asked me to drop off some of the children's old things," she said, her lips curled in a faint sneer as she surveyed the cramped living room. She stepped inside, her expensive heels clicking on the cheap floor, an invader from a different world. She placed the box down and lingered, her eyes cataloging every sign of Eleanor's reduced circumstances. "Well," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with faux pity, "it seems you found a place that's more manageable for you." She ran a finger along a dusty bookshelf, leaving a clean streak. "You know," she continued, turning to face Eleanor with a look of pure malice, "you really should know that Richard is doing wonderfully. Thriving, in fact. He and Sophia Hayes are closing a massive deal next month. It's amazing what a man can achieve when he's not being dragged down by a sinking ship." Sophia. The name struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Sophia Hayes, Richard's brilliant, beautiful business partner. The woman she had hosted in her own home, whose ambition she had admired. It wasn't just an affair, it was a conspiracy. The trips, the late nights, the secret finances, it all snapped into a horrifyingly clear picture. Beatrice watched the realization dawn on Eleanor's face, and she smiled, a predator savoring its kill. "Don't look so surprised, dear," she cooed. "A man like my son needs a winner by his side. You should be happy for him. After all, you did this to him. You did this to yourself." And with that final, venomous twist of the knife, she turned and left. Eleanor didn't cry. She was too far gone for tears. She simply stood in the middle of the room, the name Sophia echoing in the ruins of her mind. Later that week, during their supervised visit, 10-year-old Leo looked around the small apartment, his eyes wide with a child's blunt honesty. "Mommy," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "are we poor now?" Beside him, 14-year-old Lily just stared at her mother, her expression a heartbreaking mix of fear and, worst of all, pity. It was the pity that did it. Seeing herself reflected in her daughter's eyes, a fragile, broken creature, an object of sorrow, something inside Eleanor finally snapped. The sorrow that had been drowning her for months did not vanish. Instead, it underwent a strange and terrible alchemy. It began to heat, to boil, to transmute. The crushing weight of despair compressed into a single, dense point of white-hot clarity. She had to survive. Crying in the dark would not win her children back. Wasting away in this apartment would not bring justice. Grief was a luxury, she realized, and despair was a dead end. But rage was a building material. And in the silent, desolate ruins of her life, Eleanor Vance finally picked up her first stone. The rage that had solidified in Eleanor's soul was a powerful engine, but it had no steering wheel. She was filled with a cold, burning energy, but had nowhere to direct it. She spent her days poring over the hostile legal documents, trying to decipher the language designed to confuse and intimidate her, and her nights staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The world had abandoned her, and she was preparing to fight a war on her own, armed with nothing but a broken body and a furious heart. Then, one gray afternoon, the phone rang. She ignored it, assuming it was another debt collector with practiced threats. But it rang again, persistent. With a sigh of resignation, she answered, preparing for a fight. The voice on the other end, however, was not aggressive. It was calm, familiar, and hesitant. "Eleanor? Eleanor Vance? This is David Chen. I don't know if you remember me. From college." David Chen. The name was a ghost from a different lifetime. He had been her friendly rival in architecture school, a brilliant designer with a mind as sharp as a draftsman's pencil. They had spent countless nights in the studio, fueled by coffee and a shared passion for creating order out of chaos. While she had gone on to practice architecture, David's life had taken a sharp turn. His family had lost everything to a sophisticated fraud scheme, and the experience had forged a new path for him. He had gone to law school, specializing in forensic accounting and financial litigation. He had become a hunter of paper trails, a man who found justice in the hidden columns of a ledger. He had seen a cryptic post from a mutual acquaintance about Eleanor's situation, and driven by a memory of the strong, vibrant woman he once knew, he had tracked down her number. He came to her apartment the next day. He didn't bring flowers or platitudes. He brought 2 large coffees and a laptop. He looked at the cramped apartment, not with pity, but with a quiet anger in his eyes. He listened, for 2 straight hours, as Eleanor recounted the entire story, from the diagnosis to Beatrice's final, venomous visit. He listened with the intensity of a lawyer taking a deposition, his expression calm and focused, letting her pour out all the poison. When she finished, her voice hoarse, he didn't say, "I'm so sorry." He said, "Okay, let's get to work." For the first time in months, Eleanor felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was the feeling of having an ally. David's energy was a force of nature. He transformed her small kitchen table into a war room. He took the mountain of threatening letters and, with a few authoritative phone calls, silenced the creditors, negotiating deferments and payment plans they had refused to grant her. He stopped the immediate financial hemorrhaging, giving her the first clean breath she'd had in months. He then turned his sharp mind to her health. He spent 2 days researching her condition, leveraging legal and medical databases she never knew existed. He found a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins for a new experimental therapy. It was a long shot, but it was a shot. "We fight on all fronts, Eleanor," he told her, his voice firm. "We stabilize your health, and we stabilize your finances. One empowers the other." He wasn't just a friend, he was a strategist, and his clear, logical plan was the first structure she could cling to in the wreckage of her life. The true glimmer of hope, however, came from the very documents that had caused her so much pain. "I need to see everything, Elle," he said one afternoon. "Every bank statement you can find, every tax return from the last 10 years, and the divorce petition Richard's lawyers sent you." She gave him the box of papers, a Pandora's box of her own destruction. She watched him work, his eyes scanning the pages with an unnerving speed. While she saw only a blizzard of numbers and legal jargon, David saw a story. After several hours, he grew very still. He took a pen and circled a line item on a 3-year-old tax return. "What is Vance Capital Holdings, LLC?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "Some investment vehicle," Richard said, "for his high-risk clients." David shook his head. "No, this isn't a client-facing fund. According to the state registration, the sole proprietor is Richard. He established it 4 years ago. And look here," he said, pointing to a bank statement from 2 years prior. "A transfer of $200,000 from your joint investment account into this LLC, and another one 6 months after that. And another." He laid the pages out in a line on her floor. It was a pattern, a slow, systematic siphoning of their shared wealth into a corporate entity that was legally firewalled from their marriage, all happening long before she ever felt her first symptom. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. This wasn't a panicked reaction to her illness. This was a long con. "He didn't just leave you when you got sick, Eleanor," David said, his voice hard as steel. "He was robbing you blind for years. Your illness wasn't the cause. It was just his exit strategy." The raw, chaotic rage in Eleanor's heart finally found its focus. This wasn't just a betrayal of love. It was a crime. And David Chen had just found the first piece of evidence. The clinical trial at Johns Hopkins was a journey into a different kind of abyss, one of sterile white rooms, the rhythmic beeping of machines, and the metallic taste of experimental drugs. It was grueling, humbling work. Eleanor's body was pushed to its limits, her days a monotonous cycle of infusions, physical therapy, and exhaustive tests. But unlike the abyss of her despair, this one had a floor. And slowly, painstakingly, she began to push off from it. The first sign was small, a morning when she could button her own shirt without her fingers betraying her. Then came a day when she could read a full chapter of a book without the words blurring into an incomprehensible fog. With each small physical victory, a corresponding piece of her mind sharpened into focus. As the tremors in her hands subsided, her ability to grasp the complexities of her own ruin grew stronger. The two recoveries were intrinsically linked. The reclamation of her body was fueling the reclamation of her mind. She was no longer a passive victim receiving updates from her lawyer. She became a partner in the investigation. During the long hours between treatments, her hospital room transformed into a remote office. David would email her encrypted files, and she would dedicate herself to them with the same obsessive focus she had once given to architectural blueprints. Her mind, trained to see structure, flow, and weakness in a building's design, was uniquely suited to this new task. She began to see the architecture of Richard's deceit. She traced the flow of capital, identified the load-bearing lies, and noted the weak points in his corporate facade. She learned the language of offshore accounts and shell corporations, her anger a cold, steady fuel that never wavered. She was not just fighting for her life anymore. She was studying her enemy. The breakthrough came from the name that Beatrice had so cruelly gifted her, Sophia Hayes. The money trail from Richard's holding company, Vance Capital, went cold after moving through a series of anonymous transactions. "He's washing it," David had said, in frustration during a late-night call. It could be going anywhere. Lying in her hospital bed, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, the name echoing in her mind. "David," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "look into Richard's business partner, Sophia Hayes." It was a hunch, a piece of a puzzle that didn't yet fit. An hour later, David called back, his voice tight with a controlled fury. "I found it, Argent Wealth Management, a boutique investment firm. It was founded 18 months ago. The founding partners are Richard Vance and Sophia Hayes." The rest of the pieces fell into place with sickening speed. David's forensic tools, now pointed in the right direction, sliced through Richard's digital firewalls. They found the investment memos from Vance Capital to Argent Wealth, a steady stream of cash, their marital assets, disguised as seed money for the new firm. It was all there, a meticulously documented conspiracy. Richard and Sophia hadn't just been having an affair. They had been using Eleanor as their unwitting angel investor for the new life they were building together. Eleanor thought back to the dinner parties, to the times Sophia had come to her for advice about striking out on her own, praising Eleanor's courage for starting her own business. She had been a mentor to the woman who was actively plotting her ruin, a friend to the viper she had welcomed into her home. The depth of the humiliation was a cold, physical sickness. It was a betrayal so profound it eclipsed the initial abandonment. He hadn't just discarded her. He had used her, drained her of her resources and her love, and then left her broken shell behind. That night, something inside Eleanor shifted for the final time. The pain, the shock, the grief, they were still there, but they no longer controlled her. They cooled and hardened, crystallizing into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. When David visited her the next weekend, he found her sitting up in bed, not with financial records, but with a large sketch pad. But she wasn't drawing buildings. She was drawing a web, a complex diagram of names, companies, and lines of connection. At the center were Richard and Sophia. "He thought he was the architect of my downfall," she said, her voice eerily calm as she tapped the paper with her pen. "He's a good planner, I'll give him that. But he has one fatal flaw, his arrogance. He believes he's already won. He believes I am a broken, helpless woman, and we are going to let him keep believing that." David listened, mesmerized, as she laid out the framework of her plan. It was not a simple lawsuit. It was a long game. "A lawsuit would be a battle, David," she explained. "I want a demolition. He used my resources to build his new world. I'm going to become a resource he can't resist, and then I'm going to become the bomb that brings it all down." She would not come at him from the outside, as an adversary. She would rise from the ashes he had left her in, build a new life, a new success, and she would make it so bright and tempting that his own greed would compel him to come back to her. He would walk willingly into a cage of his own making. The artist who designed homes filled with light was gone. The architect remained, but her new project was not a house of love and glass. It was a meticulously designed trap of justice, and she would be its silent, patient, and unforgiving creator. Remission was not a return to her old life, but the beginning of a new one. Eleanor came back from the hospital not as the woman who had left, but as her own successor. She was leaner, harder, the soft edges of her former self burned away by the twin fires of illness and betrayal. The small, cramped apartment that had once been her prison was now her fortress, her command center. In one corner, she established a new workspace with a refurbished laptop and a single, perfect orchid. This was the headquarters of her quiet resurrection. She named her new venture Second Stage Design, a name whose double meaning was known only to her. She didn't have the capital or the physical stamina to return to high-end architecture, so she pivoted. Her new business was entirely online, offering sophisticated, sustainable interior design consultations for a fraction of the cost of traditional firms. She became an expert in creating beauty and function out of limitations, a skill she was now applying to her own life. Her success was not explosive. It was a slow, steady burn. It started with a blog post about transforming small spaces, which gained unexpected traction. A design magazine featured her story, a carefully curated version that focused on her resilience after illness, with no mention of Richard. Clients began to trickle in, then flow. They were people like her, people navigating a second stage of life: divorcees, empty nesters, young families on a budget. They didn't want the ostentatious luxury she used to design. They wanted smart, soulful homes. Eleanor poured every ounce of her recovered energy into the work. Her passion for design, once a shared joy with Richard, was now entirely her own, a source of power and, more importantly, income. She was building a new foundation, one that no one could ever pull out from under her again. Each 5-star review, each new client, each dollar that landed in her new, fiercely private bank account was a brick in the wall of her independence. While the public face of Second Stage Design was one of serene creativity, its profits funded a much darker enterprise. In the background, David Chen orchestrated the gathering of their arsenal. They hired a man named Marcus, a retired forensic accountant from the FBI, whose quiet demeanor belied a relentless tenacity. Marcus was a ghost, an expert in finding what people wanted to keep hidden. He worked with David to legally subpoena the financial records of Argent Wealth Management as part of the ongoing, slow-moving divorce proceedings. The documents they received were heavily redacted, but Marcus was an artist of inference. He cross-referenced transaction dates with social media posts, flight manifests, and hotel receipts. He presented his findings to Eleanor and David in neat, sterile folders. Inside was the irrefutable proof of her stolen life. There were photos of Richard and Sophia on the deck of a private yacht in the Greek Isles, dated a week after Richard had drained their joint accounts, claiming financial hardship. There were receipts from a jeweler in Milan for a diamond necklace, purchased on the same day Eleanor had received a foreclosure notice on her home. The most damning evidence, however, came from a series of emails between Richard and his mother. In one, Beatrice wrote, "You must ensure Sophia is a signatory on the new accounts. That woman Eleanor has a knack for playing the victim. We must be firewalled from her weakness." It was all there, in black and white. A premeditated campaign to defraud her, discussed as casually as if they were planning a dinner party. Eleanor looked at the evidence without flinching. The pain was a distant, cold star. This was no longer about a broken heart. This was about a crime. Each piece of paper was another nail for Richard's coffin. With her business thriving and her evidence secure, it was time to build the horse. Eleanor knew Richard's weaknesses intimately: greed and an obsessive need to maintain a public image of success. News of his new venture with Sophia had been carefully managed, but David's research indicated that Argent Wealth was struggling, burning through its initial stolen capital faster than it could acquire legitimate clients. They were vulnerable. The bait had to be subtle, delivered in a way that seemed organic. Eleanor identified the perfect vector: a woman from her old social circle named Caroline, a person whose social currency was gossip. Eleanor orchestrated a chance encounter at a high-end organic market she knew Caroline frequented. She looked the part not of a victim, but of a quiet success story. She wore a simple but elegant dress. Her face was clear, her posture confident. When Caroline saw her, her surprise was comical. "Eleanor, my God, you look incredible." Eleanor smiled warmly, a performance of humble gratitude. They spoke for a few minutes, and Eleanor skillfully steered the conversation. When Caroline asked how she was managing, Eleanor gave a self-deprecating laugh. "Oh, I keep busy. I started a little online consulting thing, second stage design, just to keep my mind off things." She let her voice trail off, as if embarrassed. "It's funny. It's taken off in a way I never expected. It's nothing grand, of course, but it's paying the bills." Then, she delivered the master stroke. "I just landed a commercial client, a small hotel chain. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest. I'm not sure I'm ready for it." She saw the glint in Caroline's eyes. She had the scent. Eleanor knew, with absolute certainty, that before the day was out, Beatrice Vance would receive a phone call, and the story of Eleanor's miraculous recovery and surprisingly successful new business would be reported, likely with significant exaggeration. The Trojan horse was built. The gatekeepers of Troy had just been handed the rope to pull it inside their walls. The news of Eleanor's success traveled exactly as she had predicted, moving through the social ecosystem of their old life like a virus. It was amplified by gossip, exaggerated by envy, and finally delivered by Beatrice to Richard's ear, not as a piece of news, but as an urgent business briefing. The timing could not have been more perfect. Argent Wealth Management was a glittering facade on the verge of collapse. The stolen capital that had launched their venture had been devoured by a combination of a volatile market, their own inexperience, and a grotesquely lavish lifestyle. The romance between Richard and Sophia, once fueled by the thrill of conspiracy and shared ambition, had curdled into a daily exchange of blame and panic. The Greek yacht was a distant memory. The reality was a stack of final notices and the looming threat of ruin. So when Beatrice called, her voice electric with a mixture of disbelief and avarice, Richard listened with the focus of a drowning man spotting a piece of driftwood. "She's landed a hotel chain, Richard." Beatrice had squawked over the phone. Caroline saw her, says she looks like a different person, healthy, successful. Can you imagine the nerve? After everything, she lands on her feet like some common cat. Richard heard none of the insult. He heard only the words successful and hotel chain. He hung up the phone, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He didn't feel a flicker of happiness for her. He felt the exhilarating thrill of an opportunity. The naive, trusting Eleanor he had so easily manipulated was, by some fluke, sitting on a pot of gold. He imagined her, alone and overwhelmed, a lamb who had accidentally stumbled into a diamond mine. It was his duty, he reasoned, his right, to go and relieve her of the burden. He saw a clear path forward, a performance of epic remorse, followed by a gentle reinsertion into her life, and, most importantly, her new company. He would be her savior once again. He chose his moment carefully, arriving at her apartment on a rainy Tuesday evening, the perfect pathetic fallacy for his act. He had dressed for the part, wearing an old, slightly worn sweater instead of his usual tailored suit. He hadn't shaved in 2 days, and the dark circles under his eyes were genuine, though they were from the stress of impending bankruptcy, not a broken heart. When Eleanor opened the door, he let his shoulders slump, his face a mask of weary, soul-crushing regret. For a moment, he was genuinely stunned. The woman before him was not the frail, broken creature he had abandoned. She was thinner, yes, but her eyes were clear and her posture was straight. He had come expecting a ruin. He had found a monument. This only strengthened his resolve. The prize was even greater than he had imagined. He began his performance before she could speak. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice thick with practiced emotion. "I know I have no right. I know I'm the last person on earth you want to see." He took a step closer, forcing her to either let him in or push him away. "Not a day goes by, not a single day, that I don't hate myself for what I did. I was a coward, Elle. I was terrified. I saw you getting sick, and I listened to my mother's poison, and I ran." He looked down, as if too ashamed to meet her gaze. It was the biggest mistake of my life. He let a tear, a genuine tear, born of pure self-pity, trace a path down his cheek. And Sophia, God, that was nothing, a distraction, a symptom of my own weakness. It meant nothing. You and the kids, you're my life. He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. I'm not asking you to forgive me. It's too much to ask. I had to tell you. I had to see you. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her performance a masterpiece of understated conflict. Her face was a canvas of shock, hurt, and a faint, flickering glimmer of something else. The memory of the man she had once loved. She was silent for a long, torturous moment, letting him dangle in the purgatory of his own monologue. Her silence was a far more effective tool than any screaming match would have been. It forced him to escalate, to dig deeper into his bag of tricks. Please, Elle, he whispered, his voice cracking. Don't shut me out. She finally took a small, shaky breath. Richard, she said, her voice soft and hesitant. I don't know what to say. It's too much. She didn't invite him in. Instead, she slowly, gently, closed the door, leaving him standing in the rain. I need to think, she said through the wood, her voice muffled but clear. It was a stroke of genius. A full rejection would have ended the game. A full acceptance would have been suspicious. This hesitant, wounded retreat was perfect. It told him that the old Eleanor was still in there, that she was hurt but still susceptible. For the next 2 days, he bombarded her with pleading texts. Finally, she agreed to meet for coffee. At the cafe, she was composed, distant but not hostile. She listened as he repeated his apologies. Then she gave him the first crack of light. The children miss you, she said quietly. Perhaps it would be good for them to see you more. Richard could barely contain his triumph. It was working. He was in. He left that coffee shop walking on air, convinced of his own manipulative prowess, certain that he was on the path to reclaiming everything. He saw himself as the brilliant strategist, the prodigal husband returning to his rightful place. He never once considered that he wasn't the player, but the pawn, being expertly moved across the board into the heart of a trap from which there would be no escape. The reconciliation was a masterclass in psychological warfare, disguised as therapy. Eleanor allowed Richard back into her life in carefully controlled increments, each step designed to make him feel he was earning his way back into her trust. It began with a public meeting in a park with the children, where Eleanor played the part of a watchful but hopeful mother. Then came an invitation for Richard to join them for pizza at the apartment, an evening where she was warm but slightly distant, a woman still nursing a deep wound. She spoke of forgiveness as a difficult but necessary journey, a performance that was so convincing she sometimes felt a phantom ache of her old, discarded love for him. She was dangling the ghost of their past before him, and he, in his arrogance, mistook it for the real thing. He believed he was patiently rebuilding a bridge, never realizing he was being lured onto a meticulously constructed trap door. The bait was dangled during a quiet evening in late October. The children were asleep, and she had asked him to stay for a glass of wine. The lighting in the small apartment was soft, the mood intimate. This was the moment. She let out a long, theatrical sigh, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of exhaustion. "Thank you for being so good with the kids, Richard," she began, her voice soft. It's been a lot, handling everything on my own." He placed his hand over hers, his expression a perfect pantomime of empathy. "You don't have to do it alone anymore, Elle." This was her opening. "I know," she said, looking down. "It's the business. It's gotten so big, so fast. Honestly, I have no idea what I'm doing." She proceeded to paint a picture of herself as the accidental success story, the artist drowning in a sea of commerce. "The design part, that's second nature," she said, her voice laced with a convincing helplessness. "But the contracts, the supply chains, the expansion, and this new hotel deal, it's a nightmare. I'm in over my head." She mentioned the hotel chain, inflating its scope and value with practiced ease, turning a modest boutique hotel consultation into a multi-million-dollar corporate contract. She spoke of investors and growth projections, using terms she had learned from David, but delivering them with a charming confusion, as if she didn't quite understand them herself. She was playing the exact version of the woman he thought he knew, creative, brilliant in her own little sphere, but ultimately naive and financially incompetent. It was a role he desperately needed her to play, as it was the only one that made his own plans seem plausible. Richard left her apartment that night, his mind electric with greed. He immediately called his mother. "It's a gold mine, Mother," he said, his voice a low, triumphant hiss. "She stumbled into a fortune and is too stupid to know what to do with it. The hotel deal alone could solve all our problems." His next call was to Sophia. The tension that had defined their relationship for months evaporated, replaced by the intoxicating bond of a shared conspiracy. They met the next day, their heads bent together over a coffee table, not as failing business partners, but as predators who had just spotted a wounded gazelle. "Helping her is not enough," Sophia said, her eyes glinting with a familiar coldness. "We can't just be advisors, we need control. We need to absorb her company into argent wealth. It's the only way to save ourselves. We'll have her sign over operational control, for tax purposes, for efficiency. She'll do it, Richard. If she trusts you again, she'll sign anything." They were going to rob her again, and they felt nothing but the righteous thrill of their own cleverness. Back in her apartment, Eleanor watched the trap tighten. Richard's demeanor shifted. He was more attentive, more solicitous, but his questions were now laser-focused on her business. He offered advice, asked to see financials, and suggested ways he could help streamline her operations. The hook was set so deep it had reached his soul. It was time to pull the line. During another quiet evening, she turned to him, her expression one of dawning realization, as if the idea had just occurred to her. "You're right, Richard," she said. "I can't do this alone, and if we're really going to try and be a family again, I want you involved, truly involved." She laid out her proposal, each word a carefully polished piece of the snare. "I want to do this the right way. No secrets. Let's have a proper family dinner. A celebration of our reunion. Your mother should be there. It's important to her." He nodded eagerly, his eyes alight. "And," Eleanor continued, delivering the final, crucial detail, "I'll have my financial advisor, David Chen, join us. He's a bit dry, but he knows my business inside and out. He can walk you through the entire portfolio, the hotel contract, everything. He'll lay it all out, and then you can tell me what you think we should do." It was an irresistible offer. It appealed to his ego, positioning him as the patriarch who would wisely direct her affairs. It included Beatrice, satisfying her need to oversee the family's fortunes. And it presented David, the architect of his legal doom, as a mere subordinate, an accountant who would present the prize before it was handed over. They would be walking into the dinner as conquerors, arriving to claim their spoils. Richard, Beatrice, and Sophia all eagerly agreed. The date was set. Later that night, Eleanor made one last call. The vulnerability was gone from her voice, replaced by the cold, clear tone of a general on the eve of a decisive battle. "David," she said, "they're all coming. The trap is set." The location for the final act was not Eleanor's humble apartment, but a private dining room at an obscenely expensive restaurant downtown, a place of dark wood, hushed tones, and starched white linen. Eleanor had chosen it specifically for its suffocating sense of propriety, a place where people did not make scenes. It was her stage, and she had set it perfectly. Richard arrived first, beaming with the confidence of a king arriving for his coronation. Beatrice was on his arm, regal and triumphant. They were soon joined by Sophia, an unexpected but welcome guest in Eleanor's eyes. Richard had called earlier to say he'd invited her along, to help explain the complex business synergies. Eleanor had agreed, her voice a placid pool of acceptance. The three of them formed a tight, victorious circle, treating Eleanor with a sickeningly sweet condescension, speaking to her slowly, as if she were a beloved but simple-minded child they were about to rescue. They saw her calm demeanor as serenity, her quiet smiles as blissful ignorance. They did not recognize the placid surface of a deep, cold, and dangerous lake. David Chen sat beside Eleanor, a quiet, unassuming figure in a gray suit, a man they dismissed with a single glance. The small talk was excruciating. Beatrice recounted the praise she'd received at her country club. Sophia discussed the soaring rental prices for office space in the city. Richard, preening at the head of the table, finally raised his glass. "A toast," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "To second chances, to family, and to a bright and prosperous future." Together, the glasses clinked. The conspirators drank deeply. Eleanor barely touched the rim to her lips. Then, Richard began his presentation. He laid out his vision, a patronizing monologue filled with corporate jargon about leveraging assets and maximizing growth potential. He spoke of folding second-stage design into the more robust corporate structure of Argent Wealth, with him, of course, at the helm. He was offering her a gilded cage within his own failing company, and he presented it as the greatest gift. Beatrice watched her son with tears of pride in her eyes. Sophia nodded along, interjecting with sharp, insightful points that underscored Eleanor's supposed lack of business acumen. They were a pack of wolves, casually explaining to the sheep how they planned to devour it for its own good. When he finished, an expectant silence fell over the table. All eyes were on Eleanor. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water, placed the glass down, and smiled. It was a genuine smile, and it was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. "Thank you, Richard," she said, her voice clear and steady. "That's a very ambitious plan, but you seem to be working from an incomplete data set regarding the company's true assets and liabilities." Richard's smile tightened. "What do you mean?" Eleanor turned her serene gaze to David. "David, perhaps you could clarify. You have the presentation I asked for?" David nodded curtly. "Of course." He pressed a button on a small remote. A section of the wood-paneled wall behind Richard slid away, revealing a large, integrated screen. It flickered to life. The first slide was not a spreadsheet. It was a simple, elegant flowchart. At the top was a box labeled Vance Marital Assets. An arrow pointed down to Vance Capital Holdings, LLC. Richard's face went rigid. Another arrow pointed from that box to a new one, Argent Wealth Management Seed Funding. Sophia let out a small, sharp gasp. The second slide was a collage of images. On the left, photos of Richard and Sophia laughing on a yacht in the Aegean Sea. On the right, a scanned copy of the foreclosure notice on Eleanor's home. The dates, displayed in a bold, red font, were 5 days apart. Beatrice made a small, strangled noise in the back of her throat. The third slide was a screenshot of an email from Beatrice to Richard. Her own words, magnified to fill the screen, hung in the silent room. "You must ensure Sophia is a signatory on the new accounts. That woman has a knack for playing the victim. We must be firewalled from her weakness." Beatrice looked as if she had been turned to stone. Then came the audio. David pressed another button, and Beatrice's clipped, venomous voice filled the dining room from hidden speakers, the audio from a voicemail she had left Richard, legally obtained from shared phone records. "Get it done, Ricky. She's weak. She'll sign anything you put in front of her." The room erupted in a pandemonium of whispers. Richard shot to his feet, his face purple with rage and panic. "What is this? What have you done?" Sophia began to cry, turning on him. "You said this was clean. You said she would never know." Beatrice was silent, her face a mask of utter ruin, her public image, the only thing she truly valued, incinerated before her eyes. Through it all, Eleanor sat perfectly still. Now, she rose from her chair, her voice cutting through the chaos like a razor. "You are right about one thing, Richard," she said, her voice ringing with an authority they had never heard. "I was working from an incomplete data set. For years. But my data is very complete now." She looked from his face, to Sophia's, to Beatrice's, a queen passing judgment on traitors. "I know about every dollar you stole, every company you formed, every lie you told to build your pathetic little empire on the foundations of my life." She paused, letting the weight of her knowledge settle over them. "And I am not the only one who finds this story so interesting." She gestured to a quiet table in the corner of the room, where two people, a man and a woman in conservative business attire, had been silently watching the entire presentation. They now stood up and began to walk over. "Richard, Sophia, Beatrice," Eleanor said, her voice as cold and final as a prison door slamming shut. "I'd like you to meet Mr. Harris from the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division. And this is Miss Albright from the District Attorney's Office. They have a few questions for you about wire fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy." Miss Albright arrived at the table and placed a thick document in front of Richard. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "this is a court order, effective immediately, freezing all personal and corporate assets for yourself, Miss Hayes, and Argent Wealth Management, pending a full criminal investigation." The reckoning was complete. Their world, built on theft and lies, had just vanished. Eleanor looked at the wreckage of their faces, then turned to David, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of thanks, and walked out of the room, leaving them to the quiet, methodical justice she had so perfectly and so patiently architected. The aftermath was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, irreversible collapse. Deprived of their stolen capital, Argent Wealth Management imploded within a month. Richard and Sophia, once partners in crime, turned on each other with the ferocity of starving wolves, their accusations and recriminations becoming public record in the ensuing legal battles. They were buried under an avalanche of civil lawsuits and facing a slate of criminal charges that promised years of litigation, if not incarceration. Their financial ruin was total, but for Beatrice, the punishment was perhaps more severe. Stripped of her son's ill-gotten wealth and publicly disgraced by the evidence of her own venomous words, she became a pariah in the high society world she had worshipped. Her friends no longer answered her calls. Her invitations were no longer extended. She was left to live out her days in a much smaller house, a ghost rattling around in the empty rooms of her own pride. Richard, in a final, desperate act, tried to appeal to his children, but they were no longer the confused, scared kids he had manipulated. They had seen the evidence, they had heard the truth, and they had chosen their mother, not with anger, but with a quiet, unwavering loyalty that was the final, definitive judgment on his character. Eleanor, however, took no joy in their destruction. Her victory was not a celebration, it was a reclamation. She had not fought for revenge, but for justice, and with justice served, she turned her formidable focus to the future. A year after the fateful dinner, she sold Second Stage Design to a national firm for a sum that guaranteed her and her children security for life. The business had served its purpose. It had been her lifeboat, her weapon, and her proof to herself that she could not only survive, but thrive. Now, she wanted something different. She wanted peace. She bought a modest, beautiful home in a quiet town by the sea, a place filled with light and the scent of salt air. It was a house she designed not for show, but for living. Her relationship with David Chen settled into a deep and abiding friendship, a partnership built on a foundation of absolute trust and mutual respect, a quiet, sturdy structure that stood in stark contrast to the glittering, hollow facade of her former marriage. It was on a calm summer evening, as they sat on the porch of this new house watching the sunset, that David handed her one last folder. "I was closing out the final accounts from the case," he said, "and I found something, an anomaly." He showed her a statement from the hospital that had administered her clinical trial. The payments had not come from her insurance, nor from the funds she had scraped together. They had come, in full, from a private trust. "I had to do some digging," David continued, his voice soft. "It was set up over 20 years ago. The sole benefactor was listed as Eleanor Vance. The trust was established by your father." Eleanor stared at him, speechless. Her father, a quiet, observant man, had passed away years ago. He had always been kind to Richard, but there had been a reservation in his eyes, a watchfulness she had never understood. David explained. Her father, a man who had built his own fortune from nothing, had a preternatural sense for character. He had seen the latent greed and selfishness in Richard long before Eleanor had, and so he had taken out a secret insurance policy on his daughter's happiness. He had created a multi-million-dollar trust managed by a discreet law firm with a single, specific instruction. Its existence was to be revealed to Eleanor only in the event of a catastrophic life event, specifically a severe medical diagnosis or a divorce. The life-saving treatment that had been the catalyst for her entire rebirth, the very foundation of her victory, had not been a matter of luck or chance. It had been a gift. It was her father's love, reaching across the years from beyond the grave, to build a firewall around her that Richard's betrayal could never breach. The tears that came to Eleanor's eyes were not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. Her victory was not just her own, it was her inheritance. She looked out at the ocean, at the endless horizon, and finally understood. The world could be a dark and treacherous place, but the foundations of true love were unshakable. Richard had tried to build an empire on greed, and it had crumbled to dust. Her father had built a fortress out of love, and it had stood the test of time, of illness, and of evil. It is a lesson worth remembering. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For in that silence, they are not breaking. They are listening, they are learning, and they are drawing strength from foundations you cannot see. They are rebuilding their world, and when they are finished, they will be unbreakable. Join us next time on Triatien Gia de Dien Hues for another story of tangled lives and hidden truths. Good night.